Okay, everybody, we're going to give this another try. This is part two, and I've moved my face to the other side so it doesn't get in the way of these slides. So, another reason you might wish to do any sort of penetration test is that there are some regulations that require it. Right now, sort of the most well-known requirement is by the organization that is in charge of credit cards. So this is the PCI DSS requirements for doing penetration tests, and they're fairly detailed. If you want to go look for them online, I think they are just at over about 100 pages long, and there are a couple important takeaways here. It requires that penetration tests be done at least once a year. And more frequently than that if you've updated the system. So if you put a new router in, for example, you would want to go ahead and test it right after that infrastructure upgrade. So that's how that works. At the very least, though, if there are no changes, you would do this once a year. And it requires both internal and external testing. And if you find anything as a result of this penetration test, then that needs to be remediated, and then it gets tested again. Now, after the book talks about internal and external testing here, then the next part of the textbook talks about either having internal teams or external teams, and there's a little bit of ambiguity here. That is probably worth mentioning because when we're talking about internal or external teams, this can mean a couple different things, an internal or external test. If you have an internal test, this is a penetration test that starts with somebody that has access to the network. So it's a penetration test from inside the organization. If you have an external test, and this is probably what we most think of, is if you have somebody that is starting from outside the organization. So if I was going to go try to hack into, say, do a penetration test for MasterCard, and I started from inside their network, that would be an internal test. And if I started from, say, the Calhoun network, that would be an external test, because that's something that's outside of the network that I'm trying to get into. Now, I think most of us are probably pretty clear on why you would want to have an external test, but an internal test may seem a little bit more puzzling. Those of you that have been in the defense industry or that have worked in the military, though, are probably familiar with this. One of the big things that organizations have to worry about now is what are considered to be insider threats. And an insider threat is somebody who's like a disgruntled employee or somebody that already has access to to the system, at least a system inside a corporation or inside the military. And they're trying to get data that they shouldn't, or compromise systems in some way. Most of the really famous spies that you've heard about have been people that were insider threats to some sort of organization. Very few of the famous hacks have come from people that have just been completely outside. One that's been in the news recently has been Chelsea Manning, and that's somebody that was an insider threat. So now, when the book here talks about penetration testing teams, it talks about internal teams and external teams, and those aren't necessarily the same thing as having an internal test or an external test. So that's why this can get confusing. If you have an internal team, let's say that I work for a defense contractor, which is true. So let's say that I want to put together a team that's going to do a penetration test on our network. If that team is composed of Northrop Grumman employees, if the company that we're doing this for is Northrop Grumman, then that's an internal team. And an internal team could do an internal test or an external test, depending on what they would want to do, or they could do both. If I go out and I contract with some other company to do a penetration test of the network for the company that I'm working for, that's going to be an external team. And they could also do an internal test or an external test, provided I gave them access to the network. And there are a couple pros and cons of these sort of internal teams here. If you have an internal team, they're going to already be familiar with the network, so that may make them better at being able to get into parts of it because they're going to know about it. It actually may make them worse because if they were involved in coming up with the rules and the protections for that network, then they mean the other ways to get into it might not occur to them, right? Since they're already employees, that may be a lower cost. You're not having to go out and pay somebody an additional resource to do this. And if you have somebody who was in charge of setting it up and they want to tell you how great their network defense is, they may not work quite as hard to hack into it, and as a result, the results of the penetration test might not be as accurate as you would hope. That's what that may have a vested interest in controls means. Sometimes you don't necessarily want the same people doing the penetration test as you would the people that defended it. There's a sort of ridiculous story out there of a company that decided to pay their software testers a bonus if they were able to find additional bugs in the software. And this pretty quickly led to a black market where software coders would write in bugs, tell the testers where they were, and then they would split the money. So there can be some unintended consequences of having internal teams. As a general rule, an external team is going to be generally more skillful in the way. The reason for this is that if you have an external team, they probably are going from company to company to company and doing penetration tests all the time. That may be very close to just the only thing that they do. If you have an internal team, probably they do a penetration test and then they go back to whatever their normal job was. So you're probably going to get attackers that are more skillful, or at least simulated attackers that are more skillful with an external team. The downside for this, though, is that you've got to pay them. There's going to be a cost associated with that that's probably going to be higher than if you used an internal team. I believe the last time I checked, Dynetics actually had a team of people that did this, and they contracted out at various defense firms in the Huntsville area. It was the Dynetics White Hat hackers. So, but be aware of some of those things that can the pros and cons of those. There are a couple different models for how to think about pen testing, and the book talks about two of them in this chapter. This one is the one that was developed by CompTIA, and it's important to be at least have a passing familiarity with this one, because this is how a lot of the book is organized. So the steps we're reading from left to right are planning and scoping, information gathering and vulnerability identification, attacking and exploiting, and then reporting and communicating results. So most of what we're going to be doing for the rest of this class is the first three of these. The reporting and communicating results isn't terribly interesting from a technical point of view, and that works out well because that's the last chapter or two that we won't get to in this book anyway. But we'll get to the first three. If you're talking about planning and scoping, is just sort of sitting down and figuring out what you're going to do. I think if you guys have been involved in any sort of long-term process or sort of complicated project for anything, the military or military contractors are good at remembering to do this. I think they're going to come up with a plan before they actually start implementing whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. Prior planning prevents poor performance is something that you've probably heard a lot. Or the stereotypical failing to plan is planning to fail, right? Something that I've heard from project managers around Huntsville, and this really strikes me as something that's worth remembering, is that planning is nothing, or the plan is nothing, but planning is everything. What this means is, if you have any sort of complicated project that you're going to be working on, the plan is going to change. Every government project that I've been on, the plan has changed significantly before the end of the project. But that doesn't mean that the plan is useless. That means that the planning that went into coming up with this plan allowed you to come up with alternatives and think through what's at stake here and how you're gonna adjust the plan if things go wrong. I worked with a project manager once a while ago who introduced any sort of plan is this is the plan that we will probably deviate from. It didn't mean he was a bad manager. It just meant that he'd understood that planning is complicated, and even if you don't stick to the exact plan, planning is still something that's important. And we will cover planning and scoping in Chapter 2. So that's the plan for how we're going to do this. Information gathering and vulnerability identification is going to be in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. And this is when we're just sort of gathering as much information as we can about the system that we're attempting to compromise. There's some steps within that process that we'll get into as we go along farther in the book. The attacking and exploiting is pretty much what we're going to do for the rest of the class, and that there are specific techniques that can be used to compromise systems, and those are going to vary on the system. Depends on the system that we're trying to compromise. So that's what attacking and exploiting has to do with, and reporting and communicating results, which we probably won't actually do much in this class, has to do with sort of writing up the results of the test and putting them in a format that everybody can understand, and sort of suggesting how problems that you found could be remediated. But that's the 4 steps that CompTIA has come up with for their model of the pen testing process. Now, the next thing that you can see here is a slightly different model, and this one looks a little bit more complicated, and because of that it will probably not surprise you to know that it has been developed by a defense contractor. This is from Lockheed Martin. And what you can see here is that this one is also read from left to right, so it starts with reconnaissance, and then weaponization and delivery, and exploitation, installation, command and control, and actions on objectives. It's probably desirable to know the general order of these as well. And I think probably that's easier to see if we can understand a couple things about it. The first thing is how these two models line up. And this may seem a little bit confusing, but what I want you guys to see is that reconnaissance really sort of corresponds to this information gathering and vulnerability identification from the previous model that we saw. And then basically steps 2 through 7 all have to do with attacking and exploiting. Those are on this way of looking at it, that's broken down into sort of a lot more subsequent steps. You'll also notice that in the kill chain, which is this bottom model here, there's nothing that's done for planning and scoping, and there's nothing that's done for communicating and reporting results. It's just not considered to be quite as important there. So let me go back to this, and we're just going to talk about what each one of these steps means. I think there is a question in the homework that asks you to put this in order. That's pretty straightforward to do once you're actually looking at the slide. But if this may be something that you wish to keep in your head, and I think that's probably easier to do if we understand what each one of them is. That one of the takeaways from this whole thing overall is one of the things that Lockheed wants to sort of get across is that if you're going to have a successful penetration test, it comes as a result of a series of sequential actions, all of which have to go correctly. So if you're trying to prevent access from your system and you are able to stop the cyber kill train on step 2, that's great. If you're able to stop it on step 3, then that's still fine. At least you've stopped it. It doesn't really matter where you stop it, as long as it stopped somewhere in there. So it's an example of a way that you can think about this is if you have any sort of accident or something that goes wrong, it's not usually as a result of one decision that went badly. It's a result of a whole bunch of steps, and the cyber kill train is a way of thinking about what those steps are. Okay, so reconnaissance sort of maps directly to information gathering and vulnerability assessment. That's when we're just looking around trying to get as much information about the system that we're trying to hack into. weaponization is a sort of the development of a specific attack tool that will give you access to whatever system you're trying to compromise. So that's based on the information that you were able to get in the reconnaissance step. So if you write this for the wrong system, it's probably not going to work. But that's sort of the development of a tool that's going to get you in. And this is typically the model that Lockheed is talking about here. This is typically some sort of malware. In step 3, that malware is actually delivered, and it gets to the system and is there. Exploitation is when the payload for that is triggered. Somebody inadvertently installs that on the system, and at that point the malware has access to whatever system it is that you're trying to compromise. So most malware, though, at least in this model, is not designed to give permanent access. It's just designed to sort of give you temporary access. And this thing, the next step, installation, is where the access to the system is made persistent. So it's going to still be there after a reboot or after something else happens. And that's that at this point the system is really sort of badly compromised. Command and control is going to have to do with the sort of things you can do to whatever the compromised system is after you have the ability to control it. So if that's modifying, well, that's it's not so much modifying information. That's going to be something that shows up in action on objectives. But if you're trying to, say, build a botnet to take somebody's site down with the DDoS attack, getting ready with that and trying to get those mechanisms in place would be something that, as command and control, it's something that you can do. That's not the end goal, but it's it can only be done once you have a command and control of the system, hence the name. So if your goal at this point is to break into other systems on the network, you can see how having command and control of the system that you're on right now would give you the ability to do reconnaissance on other systems in the organization. So you may actually sort of repeat the process, going from step 6 back to 1. Actions on objectives here are pretty much what the end goal. So if you're gonna erase the backup tapes, or if you're gonna copy the data to sell it to the Saudi Arabians or something, whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing at that point is going to be the actions on objectives. And at that point, you've pretty much finished the exercise, at least according to the cyber kill chain. So this is going to be the end of the second video, and we will pick it up on page 17 when we talk about tools that you can use to accomplish all this.